Hey, it's Dan from The Plague. Welcome to another episode of Hidden Gems. It's been a little while since we've done one of these, but trying to get back into the swing of things. And joining me, as usual, Nels.
Hello.
Yeah, so just, if you haven't seen this before, basically what we do is we look back at records, heavy metal, hard rock albums that we feel like are deserving of more attention, like maybe they kind of slipped under the radar, they just weren't as popular as some of the others by these bands, or maybe it's just a band that we feel like is deserving of more attention, which I think is a good your choice this month is a good example of that.
Right.
So I'm going to kick this off, and my choice for this episode is the 1995 album Stranger in Us All by Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow. So this was during that strange time when he had left Deep Purple for the second time, or they kicked him out. I think it was a mutual parting of the ways by that point.
Probably.
And he decided to do a solo album, apparently. And then, as usual, the record label was like, well, if you make this a Rainbow album, it'll be more successful and blah, blah, blah.
Okay.
So we did that. Which and unfortunately, this would have been like the perfect time to get back together with Dio, because he was kind of, this was around the time of Angry Machines and not doing his best stuff, and it would have been great to see what they could have come up with together.
Feels like that bridge was pretty burned. Well, yeah. I guess, yeah. At least to hear Dio tell it.
Yes, right. But anyways, so he ended up getting singer Doogie White, who at this time was still a pretty young, new guy. He's gone on to do, he's been with like every band at some point. It seems like he had his own band Cornerstone. He sang with Tank for a while.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he's done stuff with Michael Schenker, just a bunch of different bands.
And this is the only Rainbow.
This is the only album. Yeah, it was like a one-off reunion. It was really strange. It kind of came out of nowhere. I don't even remember how I heard about it. I might have just seen it at like the Record Garden or something.
Oh my God.
But yeah, to me, it's actually a much better album than the ones he did in the 80s, which, those have kind of grown on me over time just because, his playing is so good. And like, there are some good songs on those albums. But you just have to go back to the time when it's like, you had these 3 classic albums and a live album with Dio. And then it's like, okay, we're going to go in the more commercial direction for the 80s. They get Graham Bonnet and they get Joe Lynn Turner. And they're just, they're more straightforward kind of lyrics and songs. And at the time, I was just very like, okay, I don't want to hear any of that. This is not what I want from Rainbow.
Right.
So I was actually happy when he went back to Deep Purple at that point. But the material on here is a little bit more, it's kind of a blend of everything that he did with Rainbow before. It's got a little bit more of the 70s vibe to it, a little bit more of the, I don't know, like mystique to some of the songs. And it's definitely heavier than the stuff he did in the 80s.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for sure.
And for a 90s album, it actually sounds pretty good. Like the production on it's pretty solid. It's a little bit maybe like, what's the word I'm looking for? Like a little too clinical at times. Like it's a little bit too clean, but that's like a mild, issue for an album, especially in the 90s.
Right, especially in the 90s. Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't realize that whole thing about the solo album, that it was supposed to be a solo album.
Yeah, I didn't either.
That's kind of interesting. I guess, Tony Iommi did the same thing, right? Where he did his solo album and the record company was like, no, it has to be a Black Sabbath album.
Right.
But it's interesting. Do you know if this was all like, did he write all the material and it was a done thing and they were just about to put it out as a solo album, or did it change?
That's a good question. I don't know that. I just saw that today when I was kind of looking through things last minute about the solo album. But to To me, it sounds like if it had been a solo album, it would have been compared to Rainbow anyways.
Yeah, that's true. Right.
Because it sounds more like Rainbow than it does Deep Purple for sure.
Yeah, I agree.
There's a couple songs like Wolf to the Moon, Too Late for Tears that kind of have a little bit faster, heavier sound.
Right. I have to admit, I hadn't listened to this Rainbow album potentially ever until, and when you picked it, of course, I went and listened to it, and it's a pretty amazing album. Like the guitar playing on it in particular is just, I mean, maybe it's obvious that it, maybe I'm seeing some of the solo album features of the album because I felt like he soloed like quite a bit. Like there's quite a bit of guitar stuff on here. So maybe that makes sense that it was a solo album that got switched up. I don't know. But yeah, the guitar playing is amazing on it. It's really good. And I don't hate the singer, which for me, a lot of later Rainbow, it's like, it just wasn't for this, not my cup of tea on the singer.
Yeah.
But yeah, he sounds pretty good. So
yeah, and I could see him pulling off like both the Joe Lynn Turner and the Dio stuff like reasonably well, like
live. Yeah, right.
So I thought he was a pretty good choice. But so there's a couple songs on here too, like Ariel, that I know that Blackmore's Night, which is the band he formed after this with Candace Knight, they've done that on one of their albums. I think they play it live sometimes.
Oh, that's cool.
They do Hall of the Mountain King, which has been even at 96 was kind of, or 95 was a little bit overdone, but I thought they did a pretty cool, interesting version of it.
Right.
And then Still I'm Sad. I thought that was kind of a cool way to end it. Like it ties back to the very first Rainbow album. One thing about this album is that it's never been reissued on vinyl except in Russia.
Really?
Yeah,
that's weird.
Apparently, Sony Russia officially released this in like 4 years ago. Like not even that long ago. But like it's never been reissued anywhere else, and I don't understand why. Because it's like I'm sure it would sell, especially like in Japan.
Yeah, for instance.
But anyways, so that's my pick, and it's one of those. It's such a kind of outlier for Rainbow because it's like it came out like way after everything else.
Yeah.
Wasn't really followed up by anything. He went on to do Blackmore's Night almost immediately after this tour. But I think it's a really solid album. And to me, it's my favorite after the Dio album. So
yeah, I would say that too. Yeah, I was really surprised by it. It's not an album that I've been aware of for a very long time. But when you picked it, I went back and listened to it, and yeah, I just have this idea in my head that I don't really like Rainbow after Dio. But this album's pretty good, and I would definitely pick it up and listen to it. And like I said, the guitar playing is just spot on, just epic. Great Blackmore solos on there. And really interesting, other parts that he plays on guitar. He's not just like playing the solos, obviously.
Yeah, he's always been such a unique player.
Very much so.
Like just the way he writes, even like the kind of straightforward, radio sort of songs have interesting parts to them.
Right.
Right. Listen to them. So
yeah, it reminds me of a lot of the rock music from the 60s that had a lot more like stuff going on in it. You know what I mean? It wasn't necessarily as like focused in on really, really simple, straight ahead stuff as, eventually that I think people get sort of carried away with, I don't know, having a really simple, straightforward mix, which is totally fine. But a lot of the music, I think, gets a little more simplified as well. Whereas in the 60s, they still had, I mean, I'm not exactly a music historian, but
what?
More of those sort of more complex melodic influences than what a lot of, I think, rock and roll does now. Of course, there's examples of way more complex stuff as well. So
yeah. And just the other thing I wanted to note was, here's an album in the middle of the 90s by like this kind of legacy artist that totally sounds like them. Like they weren't trying to like fit in with like the groove metal thing or anything else that was going on in the 90s, which I really appreciate.
Yeah, for sure.
All right.
Well, okay. So for my choice, I chose the first Propane album, Foul Taste of Freedom. I thought I had this on vinyl too, but I don't apparently. So this is their 1992 release. Mine is on Energy, which I think they later got reissued maybe on something else. But anyway, I think the Energy is their original record label. Produced by Alex Perry Ellis, just like every album back in that time. If you go look at his list of things that he's produced, it's really interesting. And this is a really interesting album to me because to me it's like it feels and sounds different than other Propane albums to me. Like they went in a kind of slightly different direction after this album, and I think it might mostly have to do with the production actually, because the material is very similar throughout, and I really like the more just like incredibly brutal, crushing New York hardcore direction that Propane has gone and still plays very well to this day. I really love that stuff, but this album feels different to me. I think it is mostly the production. I think it's mostly the way the songs are put together, and maybe it almost sounds like they weren't all recorded at the same time, because there's some variety in there. But I think it really works on this album. It has a feeling of a little bit more punk than hardcore at times, a little bit more understated, and I'm talking about the production values. The music is really heavy and really fast in places, but then it's not as like wall of sound in your face production wise. Really interesting, kind of different take on a band that I also like. They're more modern stuff for sure. It's also I kind of rediscover this album once every couple years, like, oh yeah, that album, and I go back and listen to it and I'm like, oh yeah, it's better than I remembered. But going back and reading some of the things about it, they were noted for being sort of a mixing in rap elements into their songs.
Oh yeah.
When I read that, I was like, wait a second, really? And, yeah, but there is some, definitely is some on here. Like
good.
Pound for Pound. But it's hard to remember that back in 92 or whatever, that was a fairly, not completely unique, obviously, but not as like, when people say rap metal now, it's like, oh my God, more of that,
Yeah.
So it was kind of interesting in that respect. And they kind of, I think it feels to me like they purposefully threw in sort of different things. Like there's one song on here that has horns. Every Good Boy Does Fine has an actual horn part on it. And that's really different and it works really well. And there's even like one song on here, which is actually my favorite song on the album is, and I think the most unusual song for them is Johnny Black, where Gary Nesco uses for about 40% of the song, maybe even more than that, a very different singing style. Like he actually sings in a much more straightforward way. I believe it's him because there's no other credited vocalist. But he instead of his sort of New York hardcore kind of shouting, which is totally fine too, there's actually singing on Johnny Black, and I thought it was actually pretty cool, like very different from the rest of the stuff they did. But like I said, it also works. And there's also just some great drumming on Johnny Black. Really cool double bass stuff on there. But yeah, it's a weird album because I always think of it as, that Propane album that doesn't sound like all the other Propane albums.
Right.
Which I like. I love all the other Propane albums, but it's really good. Just kind of a little bit different, I think, in a lot of ways. Like they were trying hard to try different things.
Yeah, that's a good point. It feels like they kind of locked into a groove by Contents Under Pressure. Is that the third album?
That would make sense because after this was
they went in, but
the album after this is really good too, but it is very much like the guitars are just super distorted and the production is super like just wall of sound, really compressed, in your face. It's a really good album, actually. the second album, and they do a little bit more rap. There's a collab with Ice-T on the second album.
Oh, is it really? I don't remember that.
Yeah.
Wow. I gotta check that out. I used to have several of their albums on CD, and I ended up selling them at some point. But it's one of those bands that I definitely, yeah, I would like to listen to more often.
They have that, that there's the good and bad about Propane is they've totally locked in on what they do really, really well. And so a lot of times it's, you grab one of their albums and it's like, oh, here's 10 aggressive New York hardcore songs. And that's what it's going to be. And it's not going to be a bunch of surprises, but they always get really good players.
Yeah.
I feel like they've, especially in their more later years where I think they actually do some of their own recording and producing, like they record in home studios and stuff. They've really got the recording approach down. They always have a really clear, concise sound. It's really not a lot of stuff hidden in the mix. It's very upfront, in your face. There's two guitars, there's a bass player, there's a guy screaming, and there's a guy, pounding on the drums, and that's it. Very, I guess, stripped back kind of New York hardcore stuff. I love that. But yeah, this album definitely has, to me, it's different. I don't know.
Yeah.
When I actually listen to just the material, it's like, oh wait, no, that's exactly what they do now. It's presented differently.
Yeah. I think the production does make a big difference, like you said.
Yeah, and I'm not sure, like, were they going for that production, or this is back in the day when budgets were really tight, and is it different because of that? I don't know. But yeah, it's really interesting.
I don't know if you watched that interview with Gary.
I watched a little bit of it.
He talks about when they first formed. They originally had Billy Milano as their vocalist.
Oh dear God!
Yeah, and they went into the studio with him to record this album, and it wasn't working out with the vocals.
That's interesting, and that's why Gary.
That's why, he's like, well, I guess I can give it a shot, because he sang on the demos before they got Billy in the band. And so
okay,
he knew he could sing them, but he didn't think it would be, good for the band as a whole to have him do the vocals as well.
That's interesting.
And
I wonder if that's why
it
sounds kind of. I wonder if that's why it sounds kind of experimental.
It could be, yeah.
And especially there's quite some variety in the vocal styles.
Yeah, he might have just had to come up with this stuff on the fly, and it was like, oh, let's try this. Right. And it's like, okay, that's cool.
You get 5 more takes. Go.
Right. And they originally signed with Megaforce too.
Is that right?
Yeah, Johnny V signed them, and then at the time that the album was going to come out, he had lost his distribution deal, and he was like, well, if you guys want to go somewhere else and have a better chance of getting your album distributed, go for it. And I guess that's how they ended up on Energy, which I don't even know who that is, because I think it was a short-lived thing. But
yeah, and I think, well, at least at this point, they were it's distributed by Relativity.
Oh, okay.
So,
but yeah, I remember we saw them live opening for CRI in Eugene on this tour.
Yeah.
And
in fact,
blew me away. Like, live. They were so tight. Oh my God.
They were awesome live. And I remember, that show specifically. The stage raps, Gary's stage raps were actually really cool. And the one I'll remember forever is he introduces a song. He said, "This is a new song off our new album. This is a love song I wrote about the city that I live in, New York City. It's the stench of piss."
That is just
classic. And it's also a very good song.
Yeah, it was a crazy show all around.
That was, yeah. All shows used to be really crazy.
Yes.
Back in those days. Maybe they still are. I don't know. It's funny. I hadn't listened to the album after this one in quite some time. I don't know why the name of that escapes me. It's got the autopsy photograph on the cover that got them banned for a little while. It's funny, when that album came out, I looked at the cover and I was like, this woman has these weird stitches. I couldn't figure out what. It's like, oh right, she's dead and she's been through an autopsy, and that's why she has baseball stitches on her chest. But that album, man, the production on that is like his vocals are so raw and the guitar is so distorted. It's like it's an eye opener at first.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm looking at an album right now, and I don't know if I've ever even listened to that one, which is
It
weird.
is really good. It is really, really good. But man, it sounds completely different than the first album.
The Truth Hurts.
The Truth Hurts. That's the one. Yes,
It
it's a really good album.
was Alex Perry Alice again producing it.
Yes,
That's interesting.
yeah. That's why I wonder. I guess it makes sense that if you're experimenting around it, even with the same producer, the next time you might have a totally different sound. But I just wonder, like, what all went into this album sounding the way it did. Was it like how much of it was them being experimental? How much of it was their budget? How much of it, just time constraints? I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, their next one, even with the same producer, sounds completely different. It sounds much more like On the Path that they are on now.
So yeah, if you guys have any comments out there about either Propane or Rainbow, especially particularly these albums, feel free to drop some comments and give us a like and subscribe. We'll try to do one of these hidden gems, like at least like one a month if we can. I know I've got a list of albums that I still want to talk about, so it's plenty.
Yeah, every time I go through and try to find one, it's like, God, I can't find one. Then I come up with a huge list of it eventually. Like,
yeah, there's a lot of great albums out there that I think people just have not are just not aware of, or just didn't get there.
Yeah, or maybe they are, and we just want to talk about them.
Yeah, that's the main thing. You just want to give them some love.
Yeah.
So, anyways, that is it for Hidden Gems. Until next time, thanks for watching, and stay metal.